Hello and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second episode of our first IDSA webinar sequel. Last week, Lars Nagel, Managing Director of the IDSA, was explaining the IDS in general. You can watch this video on our YouTube channel. Today, we have Dr. Christoph Quix as a speaker. He's researcher at the Fraunhofer FIT. And yes, he will explain you today the process layer of the IDS Reference Architecture Model. For those of you who are part of our live webinar right now, you will have afterwards the possibility to ask questions. You can ask them just directly, or you can write them also down in the chat function of our GoToMeeting, and yes, I will read them out. And if you're watching this on YouTube right now, you will find the link to our website and further information in the text box below. And you can also follow our YouTube or Twitter channel in order to not miss any future video. And please write your questions or comments in the comment section so we can get back to you and your questions. And yes, if you like what you see, please hit the like button. So again, welcome everybody to our IDS webinar today with Dr. Christoph Quix.
Yeah, good morning. I hope you can hear me. So, yeah, my name is Christoph Quix, and I'm going to introduce to you today the process layer of the industrial data space. And yeah, so first a little introduction about me. Yeah, as already said, I'm a senior researcher at the Fraunhofer Institute for Applied Information Technology, FIT in St. Augustin in Germany. And my background is basically data science, data management in various forms with a special focus on data integration, data modeling, and also metadata management. And I have been consulting and doing IT development projects in the life science industry, but also in the classical manufacturing industry for a few years. And in the industrial data space, or international data space as it's now called, I'm involved since the beginning, since the first ideas, which we had about 3 years ago. And yeah, so at our institute, I'm also leading or coordinating the activities which are in the area of business modeling, the process modeling, and also the information model is done on our side. As a side job, I'm also a lecturer in computer science at the RWTH Aachen University in Germany, where I also teach about data management. Okay, so the topic for today is the process layer, but I will first give you a very brief overview of the IDS in general and its architecture, how it's organized in different layers and perspectives. And then I will give you a brief overview of the process layer and then drill down into the detail level and where we can really then discuss about the detailed models which we have created to define the processes within the IDS. And finally, some conclusion and also give you an outlook to what we are going to do in the next few months. Okay. So first, a little overview of the IDS architecture from a more technical perspective. So last week, Lars Nagel introduced the IDS, so the general concept of the IDS and why we need it. So I don't want to go too much into that discussion. What is the motivation? What are the potential benefits for the IDS? But just give you a brief idea of that. Probably you are already aware of that, so that we want to establish a platform for data exchange, and on that platform we the data itself will be regarded as an economic asset, and so we want to establish within the IDS, a platform, a system to exchange data in an open way, independent from any specific technology. We want to be able to connect different specific platforms, specific technologies. It should be open to all, and it should also not should be a low-cost solution, easy to use and easy to adapt, so that everybody can participate on this platform, and either by providing some software which can be used by data providers or data consumers to enrich their data, to enrich their data processing applications, or by which can also be used by the data providers or data consumers to publish data, to use data, and to integrate it in their business processes. So that's the general goal of the IDS. And what we have done so far in order to achieve that is that we have been working on a reference architecture that describes this open distributed data market, and in which we especially aim also at data sovereignty, which is one of the most important features of the IDS, the data sovereignty, which means that the data providers or data owners still have control over the data after they have given the data to a data consumer, so that they also can attach licenses to a data set, specifying certain restrictions, for example, how it can be used, so that their data consumers are not allowed to redistribute the data, for example, or that they have to delete the data after a certain period of time. And so this is realized by specific technologies, which will be introduced later in this webinar sequel. But it's one important aspect of the IDS, and what we will discuss today in the process layer. The processes also in some steps address this issue on how to maintain or how to guarantee the data sovereignty of data providers here. So we also want to maintain the provenance of data. So whenever we access data or provide data in the industrial data space, it should be clear from which origin the data is coming. The whole process should be also auditable, or traceable, so to see what has happened. Also, this aspect will be addressed in the process models. And we are based on European values, which especially says that we respect the data protection laws which we have here in Europe in place. So this is also a slide which you might have seen already last week about the general IDS architecture. So this is a very high-level overview, so that we have different companies participating in this IDS network, and so they can provide data or consume data by using IDS connectors. So the small blue boxes here, they are the IDS connectors. And then so the data is made available or consumed by these IDS connectors, and so the data exchange will be done between the IDS connectors, which then will establish a link to another connector to exchange data. But also metadata might be exchanged, like here on the data marketplace. This marketplace, which might be a central component, does not have the data itself, but it might have only the metadata describing the various data sources which are available in the IDS. And then after a link has been established, then the IDS connectors can exchange the data directly, and it's not necessary to go always across the marketplace to do data exchange. Okay, so that as the high-level overview of the IDS architecture. And now I will go a little bit more into detail of the architecture model, which we have defined in the recent years. So the current version of the IDS architecture, so it's the second version, which we published earlier this year in April. And yeah, the architecture describes the system from different viewpoints, and these viewpoints are organized in layers and in perspectives. So we have a business layer, which I will also briefly show in the next slide. We have a functional layer focusing on the functional aspects, functional requirements, which should be offered by the IDS components. We have the process layer, which is the topic today. We have an information layer, which basically defines the metadata models, which are used by the IDS and by the various components in the IDS. And then we also have the system layer, which gives information about how this should be implemented on a system level. And then we have various perspectives. First of all, the security perspective, which is, of course, very important in the IDS. And in that perspective, we have also issues like usage control, which is necessary to guarantee this data sovereignty for data providers, for example. Another important perspective is certification, where we define regulations and rules and guidelines for the certification of organizations or participants in the IDS, as well as software components. Yeah, so the certification takes place at two levels. So we must, on the one hand, certify the participants, so to make sure that we have good participants, trusted participants in the network, so that in the network we can establish a certain level of trust, and that the people who are participating there, are exchanging data there, can trust each other. So this is the one level, and the other level of certification is done then on the software level, to make sure that the software components which are used in the IDS have certified quality, have guaranteed interfaces, so that they are really interoperable, that they can work in the network. And yeah, so this is then the software certification which is done. And so in general, the reference architecture is still a quite high-level description of the IDS architecture. So with that, you will not be able to directly implement your own system. And we are doing a more detailed specifications of the individual components which we have identified in this architecture. For example, we have specifications for a connector, for a broker, where we then really go to the detailed level about which protocols should be used, how should communication work between different components. And yeah, so this is then done in specification documents, which are independent of the architecture model. Yeah, so that was also the idea, so that the architecture model is something which is more general, more stable, and the specifications are most likely documents which are changing more frequently. They have to be adapted to current technologies, to more detailed requirements. So that was the idea, that we have two different levels of specifications of defining the real technological architecture of the IDS. Yeah, so the business layer, as we have seen, is the first layer of the IDS architecture, and this defines at a very high level the stakeholders, the participants of the IDS, and their relationships to each other. Yeah, so probably the first most important roles in this context are the data provider and the data owner. Yeah, so here we have made a separation between these two roles. Yeah, so the data owner can be seen more as the legal entity really owning the data, having the right to do something with the data, and the data provider is more the technical entity which is participating in the IDS and has the IDS software running, and and then really provides the data on a technical level. Yeah, and in various use cases which we considered in creating this model, we identified that the data provider and data owners, so that these might be really two different roles. Yeah, so it might be that provider and owner are the same entity, the same organization, but in some cases, like in a medical context, for example, the data owner might be a patient, yeah, and the patient itself might not be running an IDS connector, and the data which is owned by this patient is then provided by some organization which is really managing the data which is owned by this patient. Yeah. Then on the other side, we have exactly the symmetric counterpart. Yeah, so we have the data consumer again, which is somehow the technical component receiving the data and also running an IDS connector. And on the other hand, we have the data user, then which is more the legal entity again, which is really the end user making use of the data. Yeah, so and here between the data user and the data consumer, there might be some data exchange in place which is happening outside of the IDS. Yeah, so there maybe the data consumer provides a normal web interface, a web portal where the data user can access the data which has been retrieved from the IDS, for example. And yeah, then we have several stakeholders in the middle, and probably the most important one is here the broker service provider. Yeah, the broker service is the central metadata registry where we manage the information about the data sources which are available in the IDS. So on the one hand, data provider will publish metadata about data sources to the broker service. On the other hand, the data consumer will search for metadata at the broker service, and so that will be then also one of the key processes which we will see now later in more detail on how this will happen. Yeah. Another important role is here the App Store provider. So yeah, the App Store is supposed to provide data apps. So little applications, or maybe also more complex applications, providing additional functionality to the data consumer or data provider, so which can be used to enrich the data. Yeah, the data sources which they have at place. Yeah, so it could be some data analytics system. It could be a semantic annotation system, so that we link the data to some standards or to some official codes and so on, or some data cleaning, data transformation services. All this can be realized in apps. Yeah, so we have the then on the one hand the App Store provider which provides these apps, and we also have, of course, the app providers, so the software companies who, which are providing the software to this IDS context. Then, yeah, then we also have the clearinghouse, which plays also an important role in the data exchange, because the details about a data exchange will be logged by the clearinghouse, so that we have one place in the network where we later can see what kind of transactions have happened, and then which can then also be used to for billing, for example. Yeah, so also in case of conflict, there should be one trusted place in the network which really provides the ground truth of the data exchanges which has happened. Yeah, and here again, not really the data which has been exchanged should be logged, but some metadata about the exchange data. Yeah, so not all the details, but yeah, just a description of what has been exchanged. Yeah, and finally, we also might have a service provider, which is somehow a technological service company, yeah, providing IDS services to some participants in the network. Yeah, so a data provider might decide not to run an IDS connector by himself, but using a service provider to do this, to establish this IDS service, for example. And then we also have the vocabulary provider, which is somehow an entity which provides additional domain-specific vocabularies to describe data sources, so that they can be enriched and are easier to find within the IDS network. Okay, so that's the idea of the business layer. And yeah, so we will see later that all the errors here in the business layer or will be translated into processes, which we will have then in more detail later on the process layer. So at least somehow we can make this connection, and we'll see this also later then. What's important here, that the business layer is still independent of any technical architecture. Yeah, so what we don't have in this business layer is, for example, the connector. Yeah, so this is something which is not yet present here at the business layer. We're just talking about the stakeholders, how they interact with each other. What kind of technologies they will use for this interaction is not specified here at that level. Okay. Yeah, then we have in the IDS architecture, we also have the functional layer. I will not go so much into detail with that. That's basically a collection of the requirements from different perspectives. Yeah, we have grouped that into trust, security, the ecosystem of data. Yeah, so what needs to be done to describe data, to exchange data, then the connectivity, yeah, so what kind of interfaces, communication protocols need to be used in order to exchange data. Then value-adding apps is related to the App Store, additional services which we might provide it there. And then data markets, seeing yeah, what kind of components do we need in order to exchange data and yeah, earn money with data exchange. Yeah, so that is then related to billing, but it's also related to assessing the value of data. Yeah, so what is would be a price, a reasonable price for a certain data set. Okay, so let's go now to the process layer. And yeah, so first of all, what are the goals of the process layer? Yeah, so here we want to define the interactions in the IDS on a technical level. Yeah, so what we have seen earlier in the business layer, that was as I said, on a conceptual layer. Yeah, so we're talking about the different participants, about the different roles which we have in the IDS, but we are not talking about specific components who are communicating with each other. And this is then more detailed here, defined here in the process layer. And the process layer should also give the context for protocol specifications, yeah, because in the process layer we will see what kind of components need to interact with each other, and when we see there is an interaction necessary between two components, then we know that we also have to define a protocol for this exchange, data exchange between these two components, whatever that is. Yeah. Okay, so how did we define the process model? What was the methodology which we used? Of course, we looked at the requirements from the functional layer. We also did somehow a little reverse engineering of our use case demonstrators, which we started to implement very early in the project, so that we did not have a clear top-down approach, yeah, going from yeah, somehow from use cases to requirements and then to architecture design and so on. Yeah, we really started also with implementations early in the project to get also a feeling for the more technical requirements in the early beginning of the project, so that this is not really, yeah, somehow an academic exercise. Yeah, how we could theoretically do data exchange, but that we really have also some practical experience on the other side. Yeah, and from both of these sides, yeah, from the requirement side and from the technical side, which what we learned from our implementation, from our use case demonstrators. So we had some findings, and these findings, these results, they needed to be formalized in some way, and we decided to use the business process modeling notation, BPMN, as an appropriate way to represent the processes. Yeah, so BPMN is, yeah, one of the most frequent process modeling notations which are used in practice. Yeah, and it's also supported by many tools, and therefore we use this BPMN notation. Yeah, and as we will see later on, it's also something which is easy to understand. Yeah, so you don't have to take a lot of courses to understand this notation of the business process modeling language. It's really easy to understand and can be used also to discuss about processes with non-experts, yeah, so with non-technical experts especially. Okay, so what are the key processes in the IDS which we modeled so far? It's of course the step to provide data, to make data available in the IDS. Then the exchange data is process is somehow the core process of the IDS. And then we also have processes to publish and use data apps in the IDS context. You might think of, okay, is that all? Yeah, so, and for the moment, this is all what we have defined. Of course, there are many more processes, many more detailed processes, which we did not yet consider so far. And but this will be also then an issue for future work that we are going to define more processes, refine the existing processes, so that we are going to extend what we have done so far. Okay, so that's for the overview, and now we'll look into the details of the processes which we have defined so far. And yeah, as we'll see, there's not much magic behind the process definition. Yeah, so for example, the process to provide data can be very simply characterized by these 4 basic steps. Yeah, so we will first have to describe a data source, then we will have to deploy a connector in which this data source will be made available. Then we have to publish the metadata which is related to this connector, and then we have to run the connector. Yeah, and we will do that as long as it's required. Yeah, and maybe we need an update. Yeah, so that we have a new data source, or the data source has been updated, and then we need to start over again and describe the data source and redo the process again. Yeah, so the first 3 steps here, describe data source, deploy connector, and publish metadata, they are defined by more detailed processes now. And yeah, for example, the subprocess describe data source is described by this diagram here. So here in this, we have 2 lanes. Yeah, so lanes are the basically the different roles in process models. Yeah, so we have 2 different roles or stakeholders which are involved here. Yeah, so on the one hand we have the vocabulary provider, and on the other hand we have the data provider. Yeah, and the data provider wants to describe some data source, and in order to do that, he might have to use some vocabularies. He certainly has to use the information model of the IDS. Yeah, so this is somehow the basic vocabulary which is necessary. But there might be also some additional vocabularies, domain-specific vocabularies, let's say for logistics or for the medical domain, which can be used then here to describe the data in more detail with some domain-specific annotations. And so what we will get out of that is some metadata object, which is an instance of this information model. And yeah, so this piece of metadata will be then used in the next step to configure the connector. Yeah. So here we know what kind of data will be made available in the connector. So the connector can here then be configured to provide an interface which corresponds to this data source. Yeah, so that all the fields, the structure of the data source is correctly exposed by the connector. So this is in the configure step. Maybe we need to use here some additional data apps in this configuration step. to enrich the data which we get from the data source. Yeah, so maybe we want to add some additional annotations in that. And then this also needs to be configured in the connector. So the app needs to be integrated into this workflow of providing the data. And then the connector needs to be deployed. And the deployment of the connector will then also invoke the sub-process that the metadata is published. Yeah, and published metadata is done with a broker service. Yeah, so that we now have defined what which data source is available. So we have this metadata object again, and now we have to send that metadata object to a broker service. Yeah, so which is now here the other lane next to data provider. And on the broker service, we will receive this metadata object. Of course, send an acknowledgement that we have received that, so that the IDS connector at the data provider knows that this metadata object has been received and correctly processed. And on the other hand, the broker then has to manage that metadata, which basically means it should be stored in a metadata repository and then made available for data consumers who want to search for data items later on. Yeah, so this again then basically concludes this process of providing data. Yeah, so after this has been done, the metadata has been published, we can run the connector, and the connector will then wait for consumers, data consumers, and provide the data then which is requested by data consumers. And this exchange things which we are doing in the IDS is because we want to exchange data. And yeah, we have three basic steps here in this data exchange process. So on the one hand, it's that we need to first find a data provider. That will be done by using a broker service, as we'll see. Then we will query for data and actually also then get the result of this query. And we also need to log the transaction details with a clearinghouse, for example. Okay, so for finding a data provider, so this process, in this process, the data consumer is of course involved. So he will initiate the process, and it might happen that the consumer already knows the data provider. Yeah, so that the address of the other connector is already known, and then of course a query to the broker service is not necessary. Then the connection can be established directly. If the provider is not known, then we have to do a metadata query. So we have to specify somehow what kind of data which we want to have. Yeah. So and then this metadata query will be sent to the broker service. It will be processed there, and then we will get a list of data providers from which we will select one at the data consumer side, and then orchestrate a data flow within the connector on the side of the data consumer, which consumes the data which has been provided, and which might also include some additional data apps. Then again, to enrich the data on the consumer side. Yeah, so here it's important to note that the data apps can be used on the provider side. Yeah, so the provider can already say, okay, I need some apps to enrich my data, to enhance the quality of my data in some way, or to transform it into some specific format. And but this can, of course, be also done on the consumer side. Yeah, depending on a certain application requirements, the consumer might have to transform data into a specific format, or do some data analytics on the provided data, whatever might be necessary there. Okay, so when we know the data provider as data consumer, then we can really start the data exchange process, and this is then really the core of the IDS here when we're going to query for the data. The data consumer will somehow define a query, what kind of data he wants to have. And on the provider side, this query needs to be processed. Of course, we need to get the data from the data source. Any kind of backend system might be used there. And then we also need to take into account the usage control policies here, which are going to be extracted from some internal metadata system, or a system which manages these usage control policies. Yeah, and then this policy will be sent to the data consumer, and then a negotiation has to take place here between the consumer and the provider about the policy. Yeah, so how this policy can be established, and maybe what are the legal constraints on how the data can be used. Yeah, so a negotiation has to take place because the data consumer might have certain constraints on his system, and on the other hand, the data provider might also have some requirements on the system which is going to use the data. Yeah, so and therefore they have to see whether the requirements which are specified by the provider really match the system constraints, the system specifications which are available at the consumer side. Okay, so if that negotiation is completed successfully, then we can instantiate this policy for usage control. Yeah, so we'll have a usage control component then, which will check that the constraints which are specified there are really enforced on the data consumer side. And if all this is done successfully, then we'll send a confirmation again to the data provider. We'll also instantiate the policy on the provider side. Yeah, so it might be also necessary to monitor or to control the data usage on the provider side. And if all that is done successfully, then we will provide the query result. And we might have somehow a continuous query, so that we regular send some updates to the data consumer, and so that he will continuously receive updates. Yeah, and it might also happen that we start over again, yeah, and that we do a new query, and then the whole process has to be restarted again. Okay. Then important in this context of data exchange is the logging of the actions which have happened in this context. So for that, we have another sub-process defined which logs the transaction details. Yeah, so this is basically a different perspective on the process which we have just seen, and we have separated that in another sub-process to have a more clear representation of these issues here. Yeah, so when we query the data, what we need to log in that context is the query. Yeah. So what was the request of the data consumer? And on the other side, we also need to log the query result. Yeah. So in here, we're not going to log all the details of the query result. Maybe we'll just log a hash code of the query result, or some metadata, yeah, about the number of data items which we provided in this query result, or the size of the query result. So it might not be necessary here to really log the data instances explicitly. Yeah, and so whenever we have when we have sent a result to the data consumer, then the consumer should also acknowledge the receipt of the data, and this receipt of the data, this acknowledgement should then also be logged. Yeah, so that we later can see, okay, so there was a request by some data consumer, he got the data, and he actually also confirmed that the data consumer then received the data. Yeah, so that we can see, okay, there was a complete data exchange process in this context here. And then we can use later on this transaction log for clearing or for billing to basically send an invoice then to the data consumer about the data which has been requested or which has been used here. Yeah, and this is somehow a typical blockchain use case. Yeah, so this transaction log here would be something which can be where blockchain makes sense to be used here in this context. Okay, I see I'm almost at the end of my slot. I also have some slides about the processes for publishing and using data apps. So I'm not going to so much into details. So this is where the app provider then will make an app available, and the app will be then published in the App Store. And actually, we realized that the process of providing an app is very similar to the process of providing data. Yeah, so it's just another kind of artifact which is provided there, but in the end, both things are resources, and both resources need to be described by metadata, which is then defined as some part of the information model. Yeah, but there are very many similarities here. What we have in addition in the app context is that we also might require certification, yeah, so that the apps which are provided in the App Store should be certified, yeah, so that there some kind of quality control happens then there. Yeah, so the usage of data apps, that's also quite clear, so I'm not going too much into detail with that. So then I come to the conclusion of my small presentation here. So as I said, so the process layer provides the foundation for the basic interactions which we have in the IDS. And it gives somehow the guidelines or the basis for further specifications of the key components which we have, such as the connector, the broker service, and the App Store. Yeah, so by looking at the process model, we see what kind of interactions, what kind of functionalities these components need to implement, and so therefore when we define the specifications, then we also consider again the process model and verify that all the interactions that have been specified in a process model, that they are also covered in the specification also. It's also the basis for further protocol specifications. As I said, basically all the links which where we exchange data between two different components, they have to be specified. So for that, we need to specify a protocol. So what kind of data will be exchanged there? And so these communication links, they need to be mapped to the information model. Yeah, and the information model defines what are the objects which are going to exchange between components in some process steps. And we can also use that to verify the consistency and completeness of the process model and also of the information model, or also other artifacts which we have in the IDS architecture. And we can check whether the required information is really available. Yeah. So when we, for example, say that the data consumer should deploy a usage control policy, then we can check in the process model whether there has been a step where this usage control policy has been really received, and so that this step is really possible. The next steps are also in this direction, yeah, so that we are going to work on the integration of the various aspects in the IDS architecture, and that we formulate this IDS handshake protocol, yeah, so which is one of our main issues which we are currently working on, how to define protocols for the different components. And as I said, so this will be basically done by defining links between the process model and the information model. And we also have to look into the other perspectives, whether we need to integrate further aspects from these other perspectives. So from the security perspective, we had this usage control, which we integrated in the second version of this process model, but also for certification and maybe also data governance, the process models might need to be extended. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for your attention, and now I'm open for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Quix. This was a very detailed and informative overview. I hope our listeners enjoyed it as well. And yes, now feel free to ask any questions either directly, or you can write it into the chat function of GoToMeeting. Okay, so I have a question as well. And Dr. Quix, my question is, how is it possible to connect the process model with the information model?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So I will go back to some earlier slides. Yeah, so when we look here at the process model, for example, so here we have some objects which should be exchanged here. So in the process model, in the current state of the process model, for example, I did not specify in detail what is the structure of a query, yeah, or what is the data structure for data consumer policy here, or how will we represent a query result, yeah. So all these little envelopes here are representing data objects which are exchanged between different components. And so what we need to specify here is then, okay, so this query is an instance of some entity type which we have in our information model. Yeah, so in our information model, we will have something like a class for a query or for an information request, and then we have to link this process model to the information model. So both things are formal models. Yeah, so the process model is BPMN. The information model is an RDF or OWL ontology, and this helps us to really establish the link because we can formalize this representation.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from a participant. It is how, what, excuse me, how and what has been recently published in TIT by IDS is related to the process layer?
Yeah, so what we have in the JIT repository is mainly the information model. Yeah, so it's basically, as I just said, it's the information model defines what kind of objects are exchanged, and yeah, so it gives information about the data structures which are used here in the processes. But on the JIT repository, we don't have the specification of the processes. That's not there. This is just done in the reference architecture document.
Okay, is the question answered, or is there any other question about this topic? Okay. That was it. Are there any other questions? Okay. Yes, so I would thank you, Dr. Quix. Thank you for this lesson, for this overview. And yeah, I hope we will see you next time to our third episode of our webinar. It will be on the 28th of September with Professor Dr. Boris Otto, and we'll have the topic of data governance. So thank you, everybody. And yeah, goodbye.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.